What's going on, everybody? KG here. Today I want to show you how to set up your Samsung TV to be the best for game mode. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of the default look for Samsung game mode, so this is why I wanted to create the guide, because I think there's a lot of people out there that get a Samsung TV and they're like, wow, this is terrible looking. How do I fix it? And there's not really a straightforward answer to that when it comes down to the Samsung menus. So you have to kind of rely on a guide like this to get the game picture mode that you would want. And there's different ways to go about doing it. There's not one set way that you're always going to like more than the other. Everybody's going to be different. So I'm going to show you multiple different ways to get the game picture mode that you like and in the style that you like. Now, I am going to be using the newer menus. So if you have a 2024 TV or a 2023 TV, this is going to be a good way to go about the HDR. If you have an older TV, a lot of the logic still applies, but it may be under a different name and certain things may or may not work the same way. So just keep that in mind. And if you're watching this in the future, 2025, 2026, then those are going to work as well as the 2023 and 2024 versions would. And it doesn't really matter what TV type you have. All of this should be pretty universal across the board. There may be some specific things I'll mention that is really only for a specific model, but other than that, you should be able to get it. So by default, you are going to be in this standard game mode. You're going to go ahead and hold the play button on your remote. And then under more settings, you'll see that you're in the game mode settings options. Then you go to game picture expert. And under that, you will see that there are two different modes for game HDR. There is basic and advanced. By default, it is set to off. If you want a more accurate presentation, you're going to want to use basic. If you want a little bit more pop, but still have that realism to your HDR, then you will want to go to advanced. And I'm going to show you advanced first here. And I want to make it clear that when you switch it to advanced, you will have default settings. Then you want to go to your advanced picture options menu. Now, contrast enhancer is one that I personally turn off because I do think it just kind of ruins a lot of what you're getting with the information in the shadows, and even the highlights are going to end up getting blown out because you're going to have just more information getting clipped. And that's not what you really want when you're talking about dynamic range in the games that you're playing. Now, if you do want just a little bit more pop, this can sometimes fulfill that, but using advanced is going to be a better way to go about doing it. But if you still want more at the end of the day, then go ahead and try it and see if you like it, but I highly recommend turning this setting off. The SD2084 and the shadow detail slider is also going to really depend on the TV that you have. You could play around with it if you feel like the TV is a little bit over brightened in the shadows and you could see more than you're supposed to, then drop that ST2084 a little bit. Or if you feel like you're crushing shadows, then bump up the shadow detail a little bit. It really does depend on the TV type that you have though. But most of the time, Samsung does tend to over brighten the picture a little bit in game mode. So bumping down the ST2084 slider is never really a bad idea. And it usually results in a better image, in my opinion, from what I have seen. And change the sharpness to your liking, the color tone, and the color space to your liking as well. I like to use BT2020, a little bit saturated, but I still like it better than the default DCI P3. The HDR tone mapping is going to be set to active on the advanced setting, and that is by default the correct way that it is supposed to do that. Brightness and contrast you're going to want to leave at maximum in HDR, but certain TVs you will want to decrease the contrast a little bit, otherwise you will clip highlights, such as the S90D for example. I had to reduce the contrast in order to not clip the HDR highlights with that TV, but the S95D OLED, I didn't have to do that. So these are just some examples of times where, it may be a little bit different for your TV type, but most of the time you should be good at maximum 50 brightness, 50 contrast. So everything you see in the advanced picture settings, this is going to really be applied no matter what type of HDR mode you are in. So you're going to want to remember the settings that you like and then carry those over to the other type of HDR that you're going to use, except for the HDR tone mapping, which if you are using advanced, you want to keep that in active. And then if you are going to use basic, you want to keep that into static. Other than that, you're going to want your settings to be almost exactly the same, unless you want contrast enhancer on for active, for example, and you don't want it on for basic, then you could apply that method if you want there. So let's go ahead and try basic now. And basic is pretty much going to be HGIG. If it is working correctly, from there you are just going to set your console settings, and then you should be able to get the accurate HDR that you're hoping for with your Samsung TV. Of course, there is cases where this doesn't work as intended, and there still is going to be dynamic tone mapping applied on top of the basic settings. So it really does depend on the TV you have, but just keep those things in mind. So as you can see here, we are in basic. I'm just making sure the settings are going to be what I want them to be, because when you are going to switch from advanced to basic, it will reset the settings the first time you do it. But once you lock it in, then you will have those settings locked in no matter what. So if you go back to advanced, you'll have everything saved from when we were just at advanced, but you have to do this at least once when you get your TV. So this is Game HDR Basic. You'll have less artificial pop, but it will be a more accurate presentation of your HDR. So it really just depends on what type of person you are and what kind of HDR you like. Now there is another HDR mode, and this is not going to be using the Game Picture Expert settings. So you'll be setting the Game HDR off when you are in the Expert Game settings. If you do this, you can use the game genre selection. So if you were wondering, why are my game genres grayed out? Why can't I get to them? Well, chances are you have the game HDR enabled. But trust me, I don't think you're going to want to use the game genre selections when you're talking about HDR titles, because you are just going to get a better presentation with the HDR basic and HDR advanced modes. But if you do want to use the game genre selection, you do have that option here available. And most of them are going to be very similar across the board. And what's nice about them is they do save to whatever you set these settings as. So if you just want to have certain settings for certain games, then you could certainly do that. And you have quite a big selection of modes to choose from if you are going that route. Well, hopefully this helped you set up your HDR titles a little bit better. But what about the games that aren't going to be in HDR? Well, for SDR titles, it's pretty much going to be 38 contrast across the board. This is going to allow you to not have any information clipped within the image. So that's what I would suggest for SDR. Otherwise, it's going to be your personal preference on which settings you enable or disable. Now, what about motion? If you want to use Game Motion Plus to make 30 frames per second games feel like 60 frames per second, the way that I do that is going to be Judder at 10 and blur at 0. And if you want 60 frames per second games to feel more like they're 120 frames per second, then you will use blur at 10 and judder at 0. This is the best way to do it, and you have to know the game that you're playing and the frame rate that it's going to operate in for the best results. Otherwise, you will have some stutter or frame tears, and this is something that you're not going to want to use. And you cannot use VRR with Game Motion Plus. So remember that when you're talking about Game Motion Plus, there is no way to couple them together. If you're running a game and the frame rate is all over the place, the chances of Game Motion Plus looking smooth is really low. So you're going to want to play a stable game if you're using Game Motion Plus. Otherwise, I highly recommend turning on VRR and playing the game that way instead of Game Motion Plus. If you're dealing with a game that has a lot of tearing in it, that's the route to go. I hope you found this guide helpful. And if you have any questions at all, let me know in the comments section below. I'll be sure to help you guys out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next one.